Hello and welcome to the Reading with Cari podcast. New episodes air every Wednesdays with special minisodes airing on Saturdays on any device you listen to podcasts. Click the link in the description to find the podcast now. Thank you and enjoy. Hello and welcome to Reading with Cari, a mindfulness podcast series that can be used as a sleep aid or to ease your anxiety and relieve your stress. I am your host, Cari Favole, and I am so thankful that you've decided to spend some time with me. So we've finally come to this. Yes, we've survived the frozen fever of Elsa and Anna, but you might be interested to know that the original story it was based off of is actually quite different. If you're looking for a rabbit hole to explore, this is a fun one. There are quite a few articles out there delving into Disney's version and how the concept of the mirror shards, which you'll hear about in the original fairy tale, are actually weaved into Elsa's tale. But before all that, let's first start with a brief breathing exercise. This is a compassionate imagery experience. It's a little different from the other mindfulness exercises we've done in this podcast, but I think it's really important to experience this at least once. So I'd like to walk you through this if it's okay. If you don't want to participate, just focus on your breathing as usual and take note of any sensations you might have in your body. So I'd like for you to get somewhere comfortable. Maybe you're laying down or maybe you're in a nice comfy chair, and just close your eyes. We'll begin by focusing on our breathing as usual, slowly and organic and natural. And we'll begin starting to take deeper breaths in, but don't force your breathing. Really pay attention to the flow of your breath as you inhale, hold, and exhale, and just concentrate on your breath. And if your mind starts to wander, just acknowledge the thought and gently realign it back to your breathing. Really focus for a moment more. In and out. And now I want you to imagine yourself outside in a grassy meadow. It's absolutely perfect. The weather is nice, the air is peaceful, and as you look around, you see a wide expanse of soft, luscious grass. The sun is shining softly through the trees, off in the distance, and a slight breeze rustles the leaves. The grass sways with the wind, and you can hear birds chirping happily, way somewhere off in the distance. You feel completely relaxed in this place, totally at home. And you start to walk through the meadow, the healthy grass tickling the skin of your ankles. Perhaps you've taken off your shoes and you can feel the warm earth support your feet. You focus again on your breathing and how it is slow and rhythmic. And in the distance, you start to see something. It's the silhouette of another person walking towards you, but you can't quite make out the form yet. You begin to walk towards them as they move closer and closer to you. The outline becomes a little more clear, and you can start to see that this person is in fact a child. It's just a child, very small, walking towards you. They're still too far away to pick out the features, but you can just tell from their height that they're very young. You continue to walk towards them, and they continue towards you. And they look maybe 3 or 4 years old, that's all. They're so tiny. And you are starting to make out their features as the very young child walks towards you with their eyes wide and a beautiful smile on their face, and you find that you are smiling yourself looking back at them. Eventually, as they get close enough, they start to run joyfully, and you join them in a happy run towards them. This child is half jumping and bouncing rather than running. They're skipping along in absolute joy in seeing you. You're grinning broadly at seeing their pure happiness. You open your arms and scoop them up as they jump into your embrace with joy. Such pure happiness. They are as excited as you are, and you find you can't help but feel joyful that they are here with you too. As you swirl around with them laughing and giggling in your arms, and maybe you are even laughing and giggling along with them, you know that you're completely enjoying yourself. And then, as you come to the last loop of the swirl to rest, you meet the child's eyes, and you notice something in their eyes you hadn't noticed before. As you stare into them and they stare back into yours, you notice that they have the same eyes as you. This child is you. This child is a 3 or 4-year-old version of yourself. And as you stare into those unassuming, beautiful child eyes, you feel completely and utterly at home, knowing that this person, this young child version of you, is staring back into your eyes with complete love, complete joy, and the connection grows stronger, and you become ever more present with each other. You can feel your heart connecting together. Your hearts are almost touching as the love grows and the bond grows stronger. And as you do so, as you stare into each other's eyes and see those loving, caring eyes staring back at you, you tell the younger version of you that everything's going to be okay. You will go through some hard times, and you'll go through some amazingly great times, and everything will be okay. You tell that young child that they'll always be loved by you, no matter what. And when they need love, they can look inside, look to their hearts through their eyes, and know that they are loved by you. And as you hold that child close now, know that that child represents complete love, complete joy, complete acceptance, and complete compassion. Notice that their energy passes through them and into you, and your energy passes through you and into them. You are completely, entirely connected. You are so closely intertwined that the child starts to turn into you, and you turn into them. You find yourself sinking deeper and deeper into love and joy as you hold close the connection to the deepest levels of the heart. Just knowing now that at any point you need, you can connect and be compassionate with yourself by looking into your eyes. Those child's eyes you've just seen, knowing you can have complete and utter compassion for you as a child, and therefore you can have complete compassion, love, joy, and happiness for you as you are right now. And now take some time as you come back to the room you're in. Know that you can always keep those child's eyes with you. At any point, you can close your eyes and see that child's eyes looking back to you with love and joy and compassion and happiness. And as you open your eyes now and bring yourself back to the room, just notice a couple things around the room you hadn't noticed before. Focus on an item that you haven't noticed for a while, and really look and focus on that item and all its components for just a moment. And now take a few seconds to allow yourself to come back fully to the room, knowing that compassion and love is held deep within your heart. Great job. And now here's the story. The Snow Queen, a fairy tale by Hans Christian Andersen. First story, which describes a looking glass and its broken fragments. You must attend to the beginning of this story, for when we get to the end, we shall know more than we do now about a very wicked hobgoblin. He was one of the most mischievous of all sprites, for he was a real demon. One day when he was in a merry mood, he made a looking glass, which had the power of making everything good or beautiful that was reflected in it shrink almost to nothing, while everything that was worthless and bad was magnified, so as to look 10 times worse than it really was. The most lovely landscapes appeared like boiled spinach, and all the people became hideous and looked as if they stood on their heads and had no bodies. Their countenances were so distorted that no one could recognize them, and even one freckle on the face appeared to spread over the whole of the nose and mouth. The demons said this was very amusing. When a good or holy thought passed through the mind of anyone, a wrinkle was seen in the mirror, and then how the demon laughed at his cunning invention. All who went to the demon's school, for he kept a school, talked everywhere of the wonders they had seen, and declared that people could now, for the first time, see what the world and its inhabitants were really like. They carried the glass about everywhere, till at last there was not a land nor a people who had not been looked at through this distorted mirror. They wanted even to fly with it up to heaven to see the angels, but the higher they flew, the more slippery the glass became, and they could scarcely hold it. At last it slipped from their hands, fell to the earth, and was broken into millions of pieces. But now the looking glass caused more unhappiness than ever, for some of the fragments were not so large as a grain of sand, and they flew about the world into every country. And when one of these tiny atoms flew into a person's eye, it stuck there, unknown to himself. And from that moment he viewed everything the wrong way, and could see only the worst side of what he looked at. For even the smallest fragment retained the same power which had belonged to the whole mirror. Some few persons even got a splinter of the looking glass in their hearts, and this was terrible, for their hearts became cold and hard like a lump of ice. A few of the pieces were so large that they could be used as window panes. It would have been a sad thing indeed to look at our friends through them. Other pieces were made into spectacles, and this was dreadful, for those who wore them could see nothing either rightly or justly. At all this the wicked demon laughed till his sides shook to see the mischief he had done. There are still a number of these little fragments of glass floating about in the air, and now you shall hear what happened with one of them. Second story, a little boy and a little girl. In a large town full of houses and people, there is not room for everybody to have even a little garden. Most people are obliged to content themselves with a few flowers in flower pots. In one of these large towns lived 2 poor children who had a garden somewhat larger and better than a few flower pots. They were not brother and sister, but they loved each other almost as much as if they had been. Their parents lived opposite each other in 2 garrets, where the roofs of neighboring houses nearly joined each other, and the water pipe ran between them. In each roof was a little window, so that anyone could step across the gutter from one window to the other. The parents of each of these children had a large wooden box in which they cultivated kitchen vegetables for their own use, and in each box was a little rose bush, which grew luxuriantly. After a while, the parents decided to place these 2 boxes across the water pipe, so that they reached from one window to the other, and looked like 2 banks of flowers. Sweet peas drooped over the boxes, and the rose bushes shot forth long branches, which were trained about the windows and clustered together, almost like a triumphal arch of leaves and flowers. The boxes were very high, and the children knew they must not climb upon them without permission, but they often had leave to step out and sit upon their little stools under the rose bushes, or play quietly together. In winter, all this pleasure came to an end, for the windows were sometimes quite frozen over, but they would warm copper pennies on the stove and hold the warm pennies against the frozen pane. Then there would soon be a little round hole through which they could peep, and the soft bright eyes of the little boy and girl would sparkle through the hole at each window as they looked at each other. Their names were Kay and Gerda. In summer, they could be together with one jump from the window, but in winter, they had to go up and down the long staircase and out through the snow before they could meet. "See, there are the white bees swarming," said Kay's old grandmother one day when it was snowing.
"Have they a queen bee?"
asked the little boy, for he knew that the real bees always had a queen.
"To be sure they have,"
said the grandmother. "She is flying there where the swarm is thickest. She is the largest of them all, and never remains on the earth, but flies up to the dark clouds. Often at midnight she flies through the streets of the town and breathes with her frosty breath upon the windows. Then the ice freezes on the panes into wonderful forms that look like flowers and castles."
"Yes, I've seen them,"
said both the children, and they knew it must be true.
"Can the Snow Queen come in here?"
asked the little girl.
"Only let her come,"
said the boy.
"I'll put her on the warm stove, and then she'll melt."
The grandmother smoothed his hair and told him more stories. That same evening, when little Kay was at home, half undressed, he climbed upon a chair by the window and peeped out through the little round hole. A few flakes of snow were falling, and one of them, rather larger than the rest, alighted on the edge of one of the flower boxes. Strange to say, this snowflake grew larger and larger, till at last it took the form of a woman dressed in garments of white gauze, which looked like millions of starry snowflakes linked together. She was fair and beautiful, but made of ice, glittering, dazzling ice. Still, she was alive, and her eyes sparkled like bright stars, though there was neither peace nor rest in them. She nodded toward the window and waved her hand. The little boy was frightened and sprang from the chair, and at the same moment it seemed as if a large bird flew by the window. On the following day there was a clear frost, and very soon came the spring. The sun shone. The young green leaves burst forth. The swallows built their nests. Windows were opened, and the children sat once more in the garden on the roof, high above all the other rooms. How beautifully the roses blossomed this summer. The little girl had learned a hymn in which roses were spoken of. She thought of her own roses, and she sang the hymn to the little boy, and he sang too.
"Roses bloom and fade away, the Christ child shall abide alway. Blessed are we, his face to see, and ever little children be."
Then the little ones held each other by the hand and kissed the roses, and looked at the bright sunshine and spoke to it as if the Christ child were really there. Those were glorious summer days. How beautiful and fresh it was out among the rose bushes, which seemed as if they would never leave off blooming. One day Kay and Gerda sat looking at a book of pictures of animals and birds. Just then, as the clock in the church tower struck 12, Kay said,
"Oh, something has struck my heart."
And soon after,
"There is certainly something in my eye."
The little girl put her arm round his neck and looked into his eye, but she could see nothing.
"I believe it is gone,"
he said, but it was not gone. It was one of those bits of the looking glass, that magic mirror of which we have spoken. The ugly glass which made everything great and good appear small and ugly, while all that was wicked and bad became more visible, and every little fault could be plainly seen. Poor little Kay had also received a small splinter in his heart, which very quickly turned to a lump of ice. He felt no more pain, but the glass was there still.
"Why do you cry?"
said he at last.
"It makes you look ugly."
"There is nothing the matter with me now."
"Oh, fie!"
he cried suddenly.
"That rose is worm-eaten, and this one is quite crooked. After all, they are ugly roses, just like the box in which they stand."
And then he kicked the boxes with his foot and pulled off the 2 roses.
"Why, Kay, what are you doing?"
cried the little girl. And then when he saw how grieved she was, he tore off another rose and jumped through his own window, away from sweet little Gerda. When afterwards she brought out the picture book, he said,
"It is only fit for babies and long clothes."
And when grandmother told stories, he would interrupt her with,
"But,"
or sometimes, when he could manage it, he would get behind her chair, pull on a pair of spectacles, and imitate her very cleverly to make the people laugh. By and by he began to mimic the speech and gait of persons in the street. All that was peculiar or disagreeable in a person he would imitate directly, and people said, "That boy will be very clever. He has a remarkable genius." But it was the piece of glass in his eye and the coldness in his heart that made him act like this. He would even tease little Gerda, who loved him with all her heart. His games, too, were quite different. They were not so childlike. One winter's day, when it snowed, he brought out a burning glass. Then, holding out the skirt of his blue coat, let the snowflakes fall upon it.
"Look in this glass, Gerda,"
said he, and she saw how every flake of snow was magnified and looked like a beautiful flower or a glittering star.
"Is it not clever?"
said Kay.
"And much more interesting than looking at real flowers. There is not a single fault in it. The snowflakes are quite perfect till they begin to melt."
Soon after, Kay made his appearance in large, thick gloves, and with his sledge at his back. He called upstairs to Gerda,
"I've got to leave to go into the great square where the other boys play and ride."
and away he went. In the great square, the boldest among the boys would often tie their sledges to the wagons of the country people, and so get a ride. This was capital. But while they were all amusing themselves, and Kay with them, a great sledge came by. It was painted white, and in it sat someone wrapped in a rough white fur and wearing a white cap. The sledge drove twice round the square, and Kay fastened his own little sledge to it, so that when it went away he went with it. It went faster and faster right through the next street, and the person who drove turned round and nodded pleasantly to Kay, as if they were well acquainted with each other. But whenever Kay wished to loosen his little sledge, the driver turned and nodded, as if to signify that he was to stay. So Kay sat still, and they drove out through the town gate. Then the snow began to fall so heavily that the little boy could not see a hand's breadth before him, but still they drove on. He suddenly loosened the cord so that the large sled might go on without him, but it was of no use. His little carriage held fast, and away they went like the wind. Then he called out loudly, but nobody heard him, while the snow beat upon him, and the sledge flew onward. Every now and then it gave a jump, as if they were going over hedges and ditches. The little boy was frightened, and tried to say a prayer, but he could remember nothing but the multiplication table. The snowflakes became larger and larger, till they appeared like great white birds. All at once they sprang on one side. The great sledge stopped, and the person who had driven it rose up. The fur and the cap, which were made entirely of snow, fell off, and he saw a lady, tall and white. It was the Snow Queen. "You have driven well," said she, "but why do you tremble so? Here, creep into my warm fur." Then she seated him beside her in the sledge, and as she wrapped the fur around him, he felt as if he were sinking into a snowdrift. "Are you still cold?" she asked, as she kissed him on the forehead. The kiss was colder than ice. It went quite through to his heart, which was almost a lump of ice already. He felt as if he were going to die, but only for a moment. He soon seemed quite well, and did not notice the cold all around him.
"My sledge! Don't forget my sledge!"
was his first thought. And then he looked and saw that it was bound fast to one of the white birds, which flew behind him. The Snow Queen kissed little Kay again, and by this time he had forgotten little Gerda, his grandmother, and all at home. "Now you must have no more kisses," she said, "or I should kiss you to death." Kay looked at her. She was so beautiful, he could not imagine a more lovely face. She did not now seem to be made of ice, as when he had seen her through his window, and she had nodded to him. In his eyes she was perfect, and he did not feel at all afraid. He told her he could do mental arithmetic as far as fractions, and that he knew the number of square miles and the number of inhabitants in the country. She smiled, and it occurred to him that she thought he did not yet know so very much. He looked round the vast expanse as she flew higher and higher with him upon a black cloud, while the storm blew and howled as if it were singing songs of olden time. They flew over woods and lakes, over sea and land. Below them roared the wild wind, wolves howled, and the snow crackled. Over them flew the black, screaming crows, and above all shone the moon, clear and bright. And so Kay passed through the long, long winter's night, and by day he slept at the feet of the Snow Queen. The 7th story, of the Palace of the Snow Queen and what happened there at last. The walls of the palace were formed of drifted snow, and the windows and doors of cutting winds. There were more than 100 rooms in it, all as if they had been formed of snow blown together. The largest of them extended for several miles. They were all lighted up by the vivid light of the aurora, and were so large and empty, so icy cold and glittering. There were no amusements here, not even a little bear's ball, when the storm might have been the music, and the bears could have danced on their hind legs and shown their good manners. There were no pleasant games of snapdragon, or touch, nor even a gossip over the tea table for the young lady foxes. Empty, vast, and cold were the halls of the Snow Queen. The flickering flames of the northern lights could be plainly seen, whether they rose high or low in the heavens, from every part of the castle. In the midst of this empty, endless hall of snow was a frozen lake, broken on its surface into 1,000 forms. Each piece resembled another, because each was in itself perfect as a work of art. And in the center of this lake sat the Snow Queen when she was at home. She called the lake the Mirror of Reason, and said that it was the best, and indeed the only one in the world. Little Kay was quite blue with cold, indeed almost black, but he did not feel it, nor the Snow Queen had kissed away the icy shiverings, and his heart was already a lump of ice. He dragged some sharp, flat pieces of ice to and fro, and placed them together in all kinds of positions, as if he had wished to make something out of them, just as we try to form various figures with little tablets of wood, which we call a Chinese puzzle. Kay's fingers were very artistic. It was the icy game of reason at which he played, and in his eyes the figures were very remarkable, and of the highest importance. This opinion was owing to the splinter of glass still sticking in his eye. He composed many complete figures, forming different words, but there was one word he never could manage to form, although he wished it very much. It was the word eternity. The Snow Queen had said to him, "When you can find out this, you shall be your own master, and I will give you the whole world and a new pair of skates." But he could not accomplish it. "Now I must hasten away to warmer countries," said the Snow Queen. "I will go and look into the black craters of the tops of the burning mountains, Etna and Vesuvius, as they are called. I shall make them look white, which shall be good for them, and for the lemons and the grapes." And away flew the Snow Queen, leaving little Kay quite alone in the great hall, which was so many miles in length. He sat and looked at his pieces of ice, and was thinking so deeply, and sat so still, that anyone might have supposed he was frozen. Just at this moment it happened that little Gerda came through the great door of the castle. Cutting winds were raging round her, but she offered up a prayer, and the winds sank down as if they were going to sleep. On she went till she came to the large empty hall, and caught sight of Kay. She knew him directly. She flew to him, and threw her arms around his neck, and held him fast, while she exclaimed,
"Kay, dear little Kay, I have found you at last."
But he sat quite still, stiff and cold. Then little Gerda wept hot tears, which fell on his breast, and penetrated into his heart, and thawed the lump of ice, and washed away the little piece of glass which had stuck there. Then he looked at her, and she sang,
"Roses bloom and fade away, but we the Christ child see alway."
Then Kay burst into tears. He wept so that the splinter of glass swam out of his eye. He then recognized Gerda, and said joyfully,
"Gerda, dear little Gerda, where have you been all this time? And where have I been?"
And he looked all around him and said,
"How cold is it? And how large and empty it all looks."
And he clung to Gerda, and she laughed and wept for joy. It was so pleasing to see them that even the pieces of ice danced, and when they were tired and went to lie down, they formed themselves into the letters of the word which the Snow Queen had said he must find out before he could be his own master and have the whole world and a new pair of skates. Gerda kissed his cheeks, and they became blooming, and she kissed his eyes till they shone like her own. She kissed his hands and feet, and he became quite healthy and cheerful. The Snow Queen might come home now when she pleased, for there stood his certainty of freedom in the words she wanted, written in shining letters of ice. Then they took each other by the hand and went forth from the great palace of ice. They spoke of the grandmother and of the roses on the roof, and as they went on, the winds were at rest, and the sun burst forth. When they arrived at the bush with the red berries, there stood the reindeer waiting for them, and he had brought another young reindeer with him, whose udders were full, and the children drank her warm milk and kissed her on the mouth. They carried Kay and Gerda first to the Finland woman, where they warmed themselves thoroughly in the hot room and had directions about their journey home. Next they went to the Lapland woman, who had made some new clothes for them and put their sleighs in order. Both the reindeer ran by their side and followed them as far as the boundaries of the country, where the first green leaves were budding. And there they took leave of the 2 reindeer and the Lapland woman, and all said farewell. Then birds began to twitter, and the forest too was full of green young leaves, and out of it came a beautiful horse, which Gerda remembered, for it was one which had drawn the golden coach. A young girl was riding upon it, with a shining red cap on her head and pistols in her belt. It was the little robber maiden, who had got tired of staying at home. She was going first to the north, and if that did not suit her, she meant to try some other part of the world. She knew Gerda directly, and Gerda remembered her. It was a joyful meeting. "You are a fine fellow to go gadding about in this way," she said to little Kay. "I should like to know whether you deserve that anyone should go to the end of the world to find you." But Gerda patted her cheeks and asked after the prince and princess. "They are gone to foreign countries," said the robber girl.
"And the crow?"
asked Gerda.
"Oh, the crow is dead,"
she replied.
"His tame sweetheart is now a widow, and wears a bit of black worsted round her leg. She mourns very pitifully, but it is all stuff. But now tell me how you managed to get him back."
Then Gerda and Kay told her all about it.
"Snip, snap, snurr. It's all right at last,"
said the robber girl. She took both their hands and promised that if ever she should pass through the town, she would call and pay them a visit. And then she rode away into the wide world. But Gerda and Kay went hand in hand toward home, and as they advanced, spring appeared more lovely with its green verdure and its beautiful flowers. Very soon they recognized the large town where they lived, and the tall steeples of the churches in which the sweet bells were ringing a merry peal as they entered it and found their way to their grandmother's door. They went upstairs into the little room, where all looked just as it used to. The old clock was going tick, tick, and the hands pointed to the time of day. But as they passed through the door into the room, they perceived that they were both grown up and become a man and woman. The roses out on the roof were in full bloom and peeped in at the window, and there stood the little chairs on which they had sat when children, and Kay and Gerda seated themselves on each of their own chair and held each other by the hand, while the cold, empty grandeur of the Snow Queen's palace vanished from their memories like a painful dream. The grandmother sat in God's bright sunshine, and she read aloud from the Bible, "Except ye become as little children, ye shall in no wise enter into the kingdom of God." And Kay and Gerda looked into each other's eyes, and all at once understood the words of the old song, "Roses bloom and fade away, but we the Christ child see alway." And they both sat there, grown up, yet children at heart, and it was summer. Warm, beautiful summer. Now, full disclosure, I did skip 4 chapters because this story is quite long and it didn't involve the Snow Queen. If you'd like to hear the tale in full, I can record the missing chapters and re-release this story. Just email me at readingwithcarrie@gmail.com. This tale has the traditional sense of good winning over evil, to push through challenges, and love is stronger than anything. But I think the concept of the frozen heart completely changing a person's character is really poignant. To relate this to real life, trauma, whether it be physical, mental, or emotional, can damage the innocence and the purity of one's soul. That's not to say that if you get into a car accident, you're damaged goods. Rather, what I mean is that life's hardships stick with a person. And while some are able to overcome those hardships, learn from them, and thrive in spite of them, others are pulled down deeper into the darkness. Of course, I'm mostly referring to depression, heartache, loss, and even the feeling of betrayal. When someone you love breaks your trust, you then find it more difficult to trust someone else. Your heart is in essence, frozen. But love, self-love, or love from another can melt the frost away and heal the pain. It may still leave a scar, but the pain will become distant like a memory. To leave you on a higher note, the concept of forgiving and forgetting can sometimes seem impossible, especially when the issue or pain point is fresh. But instead of focusing on the hurt and giving that wound power, try instead to work through it with a professional or through meditation until you are able to let go internally. You may not ever reconcile with the person who hurt you, but releasing the negative feelings, emotions, and aura, if you will allow you to truly feel peace once more and restore your heart. Thank you for listening. I welcome you back anytime you may need to hear a comforting voice or a familiar bedtime story.